And welcome back in, everybody. Another edition here of the Auburn Undercover podcast on the 24/7 Sports Network. My name is Nathan King, joined today by Jason Caldwell, as fall camp is officially in the books after Saturday's scrimmage. Whenever classes get rolling, of course, that marks the end of camp. The practice schedule gets altered a little bit because you can no longer get your players there at 9 a.m. every morning to practice. Got classes to worry about, so things will shift a little bit this week. It's an interesting sort of in between week for this team, Jason. It's not game week yet, but as Free said a few days ago, this will be an opportunity for them to start to simulate what their in-season routines are. And so from that perspective, this is almost as important as a game week. We heard Free say they're going to start putting some Cal prep in there, maybe do a couple periods a day, looking ahead to that team, because obviously you don't want to do that during your actual game week for Alabama A&M. And then it'll culminate. They're going to go to the stadium again this Saturday and simulate that 2:30 kickoff against Cal, do the pregame meal, do the warm-up, that kind of thing. And so in between week, as Auburn gets finished with fall camp, but they are going to treat this as much like they're preparing for a game on Saturday as possible to get ready for 5 straight home games to open the season.
Yeah, I think the thing that we've seen is a lot of that prep work, and obviously that's on the field, but it's trying to leave no stone unturned. So we've seen that where you're talking about, hey, what's it like? Free said, hey, look, we'll go through pregame meal, target walk, getting to the stadium, stretching, all those things to know what it's going to look like to prepare for a 2:30 game. And I think that's important because you've got a bunch of guys that are going to be playing in this game and playing key roles for this team who pretty much every game they've ever played their entire life has been at 7 o'clock, and it's been a high school game. And now you think about, all of those freshman wide receivers, the DBs that you're counting on, Malik Blocked, and I mean, there's so many guys, but there's so many new guys to Auburn who haven't done it here. So I think letting those guys kind of get a feel for it, what's it going to feel like. Obviously, it's going to feel different when there's fans and there's Tiger Walk and all that stuff involved, but at least you're taking some of that question marks out of the equation. And so I think that's important. So it's all about trying to handle as much as you can. There's going to be a lot of unknown. That's just the way it is. So right now, I think they're trying to take some of those things out of the equation. So I like those ideas. On the field itself, it feels like things have kind of settled in a little bit. They did have a very closed scrimmage on Saturday, and by being very closed, I don't remember one as closed as this one. We've seen a lot of closed practices, and they've been more open in preseason than we've had in a long, long time at Auburn. But I think because of that, they're like, okay, we've got some things we want to do, and we don't want anybody to know. And so that felt like Saturday. What that is, we start. All I know is that I spoke to a few people that said, look, it was very good on both sides, a lot of back and forth, and that's what you want. So I think they were pretty pleased with everything they got from that, but there's not a whole lot of information coming out of it, and takes me to believe that there may be some things that we haven't seen before that we'll see once this team gets on the field this fall.
Yeah, I mean, we sort of last week was that time every preseason when you start to trim down the reps, things start to feel like crunch time, and you can make some of those lineup decisions because you're getting closer to the season and you can no longer sort of toy with things. You've got to go with what you think works. I guess we'll sort of start there, Jason, and talk about what we still, I think, need to learn about this team. Things that are, they're going to need to do the most work on, I think, within the next couple weeks. We can start with the offensive line because that was a subject of conversation on Friday. Hugh Freeze said it was, quote, his biggest worry on the offensive side of the ball. I think that worried a lot of people. But, I mean, you've got to have something that you're focusing on at this point. You've got to have something that you feel like needs the most work. And we think that's going to take the form of some changes potentially at offensive tackle. Percy Lewis, the Mississippi State transfer, he talked about it in an interview with us on Friday. He said he took some right tackle reps in practice that day. And he said when he was on the right side, good follow-up question by whoever asked it. Who was on the left side? And it was Tyler Johnson. Well, he's been the backup all preseason. And that, combined with kind of what we were hearing the past few days from practice, leads us to believe that maybe they're making a switch at left tackle right now. Maybe Percy Lewis is a guy who is not going to work with the first team as consistently moving forward. I guess, Jason, what kind of changes could you see coming along the offensive line this week in practice and moving into the first game?
Yeah, I think that, it's been a question I've had. I think Percy's probably better suited to be a right tackle. That is what it feels like to me after seeing him. And there's no secret. That's the one question I've had really since the spring. That's been the one is could he take over that role? I think after the scrimmages, after the couple of live sessions they've had, I think they said, look, let's take another look, because I think that's what you can do. I don't think it's necessarily that, hey, this guy's terrible, we got to get him out of there. But I've said repeatedly, what's the situation to get you to your best five? And so it comes down to a point of, is Percy Lewis better than Dylan Wade back at left tackle with Tate Johnson or Jaden Muskrat or whoever at left guard? Which one of those gives you your best offensive line? And so it comes down to not necessarily is Dylan Wade better than Percy Lewis, but is the guard situation better? Does it make you a better overall offensive line? Those are things. And we've seen so many rotations all over the place. They've done that offensive line, and that's what happens this time of year. So I believe they said, let's take another look. And when they did, it went, that looked pretty good. Let's work with that a little bit longer and see how that goes. So that's what it feels like to me, is looking for your best five. And that may be Dylan Wade back again at left tackle. Does that mean that's the way it'll stay all year? It may only stay that way for a half of a game. Tyler Johnson gets in and they go, okay, this is the guy we know from a talent standpoint can do it. You plug him in and you go, okay, he takes off. And then you go, okay, now we can get back to it. So it may only last for a little while if it happens at all, but that's what it feels like to me, is like, let's look at Dylan Wade. Let's look at maybe Tate Johnson. That would be my first guess at that guard position, the experience he's had, and go from there. So it's a good problem to have now, because you do have some options. That is the one thing that they've got on the offensive line that we haven't seen in quite a while. This is not a move that's made because, oh my, you don't have anybody else. This is a move made because you have other pieces that you can take a look at.
Yeah, better now than 3 weeks into the season.
Correct.
When you're like, well, this guy isn't cutting it, and you've got to make a lot of those changes. Yeah, I agree with you on Tate Johnson. We saw at their first scrimmage, we sort of made a note of it. He got some work with the first team. It was like half a drive. They put him in there at left guard. And I think, like you were saying that day, like, that's just so you can see that and see how that looks. And now here we are. So I don't think this is as much of this is not a 24-hour thing on the offensive line. Like, you can see progression throughout fall camp, even if, we're not talking to a coach about it every single day. So that's a situation where, hey, maybe they knew that they might want to kick Wade back to left tackle at some point. Let's see how Tate Johnson does there at left guard. Braden Joyner is a guy. He's a guy we wrote about this morning. A guy who certainly had a really good camp in his second year with the program, who could be in the mix for a guard spot there, maybe if not just a backup spot. We'll touch on a couple questions here kind of as they come in from Facebook and YouTube. Willie asks, how many wide receivers and tight ends do you think will reach 500 yards this season? And how much of an impact do you think Kayron Crawford will have? We can sort of go in reverse there, Jason, because we wanted to touch later on the biggest standouts from camp. Kayron Crawford, from day one, the Arkansas State transfer, showed a lot at practice. He showed his teammates a lot. When we went out there on the first day, it was very clear that he is size-wise ready to be an SEC pass rusher. And I think this pass rush group, mainly because of him, and because of what they have with Joe Phillips and Jamonte Waller from a depth perspective, I think this has a chance to be one of those under-the-radar groups that can improve this season. Because you look at what they had behind Jalen McLeod last year, I think having Kayron Crawford can make a big difference this time around. Jalen McLeod doesn't have to play as much. He can be a lot fresher on third downs. So in terms of, I'm sure you think the same, Jason, in terms of impact, I think Kayron Crawford right away, you'll be able to see what he's able to do from a stat perspective, and from a production perspective, but almost more important, what he does for this personnel and allowing you to be a little bit more versatile and allowing Jalen McLeod to be, fresher on a play-to-play basis.
Yeah, we just talked about offensive line having options, and there's a lot of options on the defensive front, and it gives you the ability to do some different things. And it may give the ability to play Kieran Crawford and Jalen McLeod at the same time, which is something that Auburn did not have the ability to do much last year at all. So you'll have that ability on third downs. And, heck, on third downs, you might see Kieran Crawford and Jalen McLeod and maybe Keldrick Falk and maybe Malik Autry all on the field at the same time. You may have 4 guys that you consider maybe your best 4 pass rush. There may be a lot of different looks for this defensive line, and because of that versatility. But Kieran Crawford is he was the most we asked about the thing that stood out to me. His interview was the most thing that stood out to me because of his confidence. And this is guys like, hey, I'm ready to go. So I thought it was really interesting, and looking forward to seeing him kind of turn it loose a little bit, this season.
Yeah, and then the other part, how many receivers or tight ends do you think will reach 500 yards? That's a good question. Like that makes you think a little bit. I think this is going to be obviously it's going to be a balanced passing attack. I think you got a lot of different guys. I wonder if Cam Coleman will be the kind of guy, like I wouldn't be surprised if he is less than 500 yards, but has like 8 touchdowns, is kind of a big play guy. I'm not sure, maybe 3. I still think there's a good chance Robert Lewis, in terms of guys kind of flying under the radar, I would not be surprised if Robert Lewis, with all the options they have, if he still leads this team in catches this year, because he's just that guy that Peyton Thorne looks at. But just like the D-line, just like the offensive line, there's so many different guys at receiver. We're all excited, I guess, to see how it shakes out, how this rotation shakes out.
Yeah, I don't know that it will be more than 2. I think it's going to be, because they're going to be playing a lot of different guys. There's going to be a lot of different targets. They still want to run the football. The only way to get a bunch of guys over 500 yards is if you throw for 4,000. And I don't think that's what this offense is going to be. If you get to 3,000 yards, you're still looking at you're still looking at a bunch of different players to add to that total. So I think Cam will probably be a guy like that, because I think there's going to be 3 or 4 plays that are 50, 60 yards for him. And when you start adding plays like that up, it doesn't take very long. I don't know that, like for instance, for Valdo, I think it's going to be hard for him to get to a 500-yard total, because you're going to have other options. Last year, he was the only option. We heard Hugh Freeze say, look, I want to take some of the things off his plate. Meaning, hey, let's don't play him 75 snaps a game. Like Robert Lewis there. And I mean, we've heard Keandre Lambert-Smith, people say he's a pro. I mean, I would say that those 3 guys would be the guys I would kind of lean towards, maybe has the best chance, but I don't think those could be a bunch of different guys over 500 yards. I think there'll be a bunch of guys over 350, 400. I think that's kind of the range I'm looking at, where you're going, man, you may have a guy this week that has 75 yards. Maybe next week he only has a couple of touches, but just think that you could have 7 guys with over 300 yards. When you start thinking about Rivaldo, you're thinking about a guy like Brandon Frazier even jumping into that as a receiver. Heck, I think about Jeremiah Cobb as being the guy that could have 300-400 yards receiving with some touches, especially if they do some 2-back stuff and put him out there as a second guy. But then, Robert Lewis, Sam Jackson, Cam, we haven't even talked about Perry and Malcolm and Bryce and those guys, but obviously Keandre Lambert-Smith, and there's a lot of people to get touches with in an offense. So I think it may be a bunch of guys. I would still lean yardage-wise. I still think Cam may be the guy that leads the group from a yardage perspective because of the big play threat.
Yeah, you could be looking at Cam, most yards, good few touchdowns. Maybe
Robert Lewis as the Ryan Davis kind of guy.
Yep, and then maybe Lambert Smith is sort of your best of both worlds.
Yeah,
kind of thing. Because he's a big yards after the catch guy. I could see Sam Jackson being a guy who leads the team in like yards per catch. Maybe he only has 15 catches this season, but he explodes twice for like 80 yards just because he's that.
I think he'll have more though, because that connection with Peyton Thorne for him is going to be really important thing to watch, because those guys live together. They're best friends. He's a former quarterback. I think he takes some of that security blanket role too from Robert Lewis a little bit, just because he understands the defenses so well. And we heard him talk about it. I think he becomes some of that too. So I think you think about Robert Lewis, Sam Jackson, similar roles in an offense, maybe doing different things. I think those two guys right there could combine for 65, 70 catches. And as you say, hey, let's kind of put those in the same category. I think those could be the guys that kind of have that role.
Yeah, my thing with Sam Jackson is like it always, you have your game plans at the beginning of the year. You have, where you think your personnel is going to go, but stuff evolves over the course of the season. I think about like talking with Ben Agamawa this preseason, and he was like, okay, after the Cal game, we realized we needed to shift more focus onto Rivaldo. I wonder if that connection with Sam Jackson is something where, like you said, you just can't replace that. And like as games 3 and 4 roll around, you realize like, look, they just have a connection. Like he's just got to be more involved in the game planning now because Peyton is clearly so comfortable with him. So we'll see. We'll see how that kind of thing evolves. I think there's no question from game 1. One-on-ones, Cam Coleman's going to get the ball a lot, and I think there's no question from game 1 that Robert Lewis. We kind of saw that in the scrimmage to where looking across the field, short dink and dunk routes, Robert Lewis can be that guy as well. Daniel asks, did Peyton play better in the second scrimmage than the first? I think you could probably say yes, but I think a lot of it because it was a different type of scrimmage. I think this is, like I mentioned, this is a lot more crunch time. Obviously, they shut things down, in terms of access because they wanted to really work on stuff. Whereas the first scrimmage, Peyton admitted, like we're still putting plays in. They were still putting in new plays and seeing them executed for the very first time. I think they were supposed to finish install on Friday. Like you're not doing that anymore. You're not putting in new plays. This is get out there and actually run stuff. And when they've had those opportunities this preseason, when they've just gone and run the offense, we've heard that Peyton has been pretty good at it.
Yeah, and there's other things to think about too. The naked eye does not tell the story of a scrimmage. And we heard Hugh Freeze say, look, they went back in the stadium on Tuesday, had more scrimmage. The offense had a bunch of big plays. And he said, when I went back and watched it, I felt much better about the first one, even though there weren't some things that they didn't make a play here too. He said, I felt much better about it after going back and watching it. He said on the Tuesday one, he said, I didn't feel quite as good because there were some plays that were like, I don't know if we make that again. It was just kind of spectacular stuff. So I think when you talk about from a coaching standpoint, I think they like, hey, Peyton Thorne did what we wanted them to do in scrimmage 1. It just didn't work out because of one thing or another. Then you start to hone in an offense as you get closer to game time. You start to go, and I mentioned it after that day on Saturday. Look, part of especially a first scrimmage is your install is, hey, we're going to run this play. Well, you're not going to run this play against that defense in a game. But in a scrimmage situation, you're like, hey, look, we're just running it, trying to execute it. As you heard Hugh Freeze say, look, and it's been really interesting. I stopped him after our last time we talked to him and said, is there anything more important than getting out of a bad play? He goes, no. He kept repeating it over and over. And people think about Peyton Manning because you hear Omaha and you watched him so much checking out of plays at the line of scrimmage. And when you think about those guys, you go, man, they get into a perfect play, throws a touchdown pass. The object is to get out of a bad play. The object is to get out of the play that has no chance to succeed and then give you a chance to go succeed. It might not always happen, but when you check out of something and you have a 4-yard gain, people might go, well, what did he do that for? Well, it would have been a 3-yard loss if he hadn't have done that. So that's the thing. And there'll be a lot of situations where it's 2 plays at the line of scrimmage. If it's run direction, RPO is going to be involved a lot of things on Peyton's plate, but the other guys have to be on the right page. I think okay, here's what we're doing this week. Here's our focus. Here's our first down calls. Here's our third down call. When you start to be able to rep those during the game week, then all of a sudden things start to click a little bit. And I think as they've moved along in camp, they've gotten on a better page with a guy that when we talked to Ken Austin, he goes, look, Peyton knows this thing frontwards and backwards. He's making the right checks, all those things. Now you got to get those young guys and the newcomers on the same page. And I think they're getting a better job of that.
Yeah, I mean, Freeze talked about that, situational work. Like once you get the plays in, now you can go 4-minute drill. Now you can go 2-minute drill or 4-minute drill with a 2-minute warning that they have to account for. He talked about running your last play from the 45 and the 25 and the 10. So you start to get to this point of camp now, like you said, where you're actually going out there and running the offense. And I think that's when things start to click. It's interesting because I think the challenge for this receiving core as compared to last year, I mean, they had guys, they had some issues, and I don't think they had the talent. This year, I think they are feeling the pressure and feeling like it's a really big key to get everybody on the same page because they know they have the talent this time. And so that's why, and Rees mentioned on Friday, that is why he has been very hard on these receivers in a practice setting, these freshmen, like going up to them right away and saying, you have to do this the right way, because he knows everything we just talked about from Peyton Thorne. If his RPO read that he's supposed to make isn't there because the receiver, ran a few feet too much to the inside, like all of a sudden the whole thing is blown up. And so I think they are feeling the excitement level of, ooh, they've got receivers that can make plays. But that goes back to what you said. You don't want it to just be Cam Coleman making a one-handed catch. You don't want it to just be Malcolm Simmons breaking tackles in the secondary. You want it to be well executed. And I think that's why he's put so much pressure on these young receivers. Hey, we know you're young, but you got to get this thing, because once you have the ball in your hands, we know you're talented enough to make something happen.
Yeah, and they have been coached up to get prepared for the season. You can tell the difference. We've been around this long enough to know when you see young guys that don't get as much or as many reps early on, they know that guy's not ready yet. That has not been the case with this group of wide receivers. That has not been the case with Malik Autry. That has not been the case with Jamonta Waller and Joe Phillips, and now a guy like DeMarcus Riddick and Jalen Crawford, Caleb Harris, Kinsley Falston. They know from a talent standpoint, these guys they step up. We got to get these guys prepared. Whereas in the past, you go, the freshman guys are not quite ready yet. You get some reps early in camp, but then you focus on your guys that are going to play. Well, they're focusing still on these young guys because they know they need them to play, and they're going to play. And so it has been a different tenor. Last year, they were just trying to figure out who could play and, hey, can you get enough guys here or there? Now those guys are there. Can you get enough guys in the right spots to go compete and compete at a high level? That's the step. Now you can see it is different. That's always the goal. But last year they're just kind of, swimming. You're going, oh, man, who we got that can do this or this. Now they figure like, okay, we've got those pieces. Can this guy be better? What can we do with this guy? And so you see that with Perry and Malcolm, especially because they're the newcomers. Okay, what can we do that they can execute? What can we add to their plate? I think that's going to be the goal for them moving forward. But there's no question that's a more talented roster. Now it's a matter of, are you talented enough at those top spots? As I mentioned today, somebody asking, I said, look, the question now is, can you find a guy that can make a play when the game's on the line? The separator plays. And those are these separator plays. And I talked to Charles Kelly about it. He's like, we were laughing because he said, those are the things that matter. He said, Coach Dye always used to talk about there's 4 or 5 plays in a game that are the difference between winning and losing in most games that you play in this league. The problem is you don't know which 4 or 5 of those are going to be until it's over with. You don't know what the play is until you get to the end of the game and go, whew, that was a big play. Now, 4th down and 4th and goal at the 1 is a big play, but it's not a big play if you turn around and fumble it in the end zone and get back a touchdown. So you don't know what it is until after the game. That's why you just got to go out and try to make a few of those big plays and be consistent and then see what happens at the end.
Yeah, I think there are a few more groups that we will be looking at moving into game week, trying to see how things get ironed out. I think, like you said, there's a lot of solidification right now across the roster, but there are a couple groups I think that we'll still be keeping our eye on. Rees said it himself that the cornerbacks are still pretty inconsistent. He said now J.C. Hart is the competition, those 3 guys that are behind Keontae Scott and Kayan Lee. He said pretty much everybody there needs to step it up, but of that group, J.C. Hart has been the best, has been the most consistent from practice to practice. Antonio Kite, every time you talk to somebody about him, the ability is all there, but all his coaches kind of say the same thing. It just needs to be every single practice, doing the same thing, repping the same way. Jay Crawford, I think, will play this season, but I think probably those other 2 guys are ahead of him in that rotation. But even going back to talking to like Wesley McGriff, Jason, I think Kayin Lee is a guy that I know we can't really talk about him much as like, a breakout guy, because like dude was playing tons of snaps as a true freshman in the SEC. And on the first day of camp, Hugh Freeze called him an NFL corner. That guy is not breaking out. That guy has arrived entirely. But the fact that he has been so consistent, and talking to Wesley McGriff, like even this is including Keontae Scott, Wesley McGriff was like, Kayin brings it every day and is consistent every day. Everyone else needs to step up. Like, I truly think they have that NFL lockdown corner potential with him. This season, we've seen it. His battles with Cam Coleman are awesome at practice whenever they're able to go one-on-one. And I just think that production from that position to be able to go against another team's number one receiver is so important because this is a secondary, Jason, that we talked about it in our exit survey on the site. Like, tons of talent, but this group is probably going to take their lumps in the first few games. That's going to happen anytime you throw a bunch of new guys together. Having Kayin Lee on the outside and saying, go cover the other team's best receiver, I think that makes a big difference. And, come the first few games, that is a group, the secondary, I'll be really interested to watch and see how they develop.
There's certain things you look for and listen for when you get into a preseason camp. One of those things is, when it's new guys, who keeps getting mentioned? When it's an older guy or a guy that has played football, the thing that you almost want to listen for is when nobody acts surprised. Like, hey, that's what Kayin Lee, they're like, yep, that's who he is. There hasn't been a ton of, oh, wow, because they're like, well, that's who he is. That's what you listen for. That's when you know, okay, this guy's pretty good because they expect it. And it's almost gotten a little bit of that with Cam Coleman after the initial shock and awe. People going, it is what it is. It's been that way with Robert Lewis. We know who Robert Lewis is, but people are going, yeah, he just kind of does his job. It kind of reminds me of the point guard in basketball. People are like, well, he just does, what I think about J.P. Big East being going, yep, that's just who he is. He just kind of does his job and does it every day, and that's who he is. I think about that with a guy like Connor Lew. The coaches talk about him, his players talk about him, but it's almost to the point where guys go, yeah, it is what it is. He's really good. That's what it feels like with Kayin Lee a little bit, where guys are going, man, that's just who he is. That's what we expect. And that's a good spot to be in, that corner room. They have purposely taken it easy with Keontae Scott while dealing with a hamstring, going, look, we don't need to see that guy. We need to get him to the first game. And I think that's been the right move because it has forced Antonio Kite and J.C. Hart and Jalen Crawford and Amon Lane Gaines. It has forced those guys to get into the mix and get some reps. I think it's been huge for them. I think they've got, when you start thinking about it, I think they got 6 guys they feel like, hey, we can go out here. There's going to be some mistakes made, but from a talent standpoint, that are talented enough to go compete. You lose, a couple of guys from last season that you thought were going to be impact players, but in return, you've gotten guys. I think J.C. Hart is as talented as anybody Auburn's had in quite a while at corner, and you got 2 guys that just got drafted in the NFL. And Antonio Kite, athleticism wise, is off the charts. There are some pieces there, and this might be where this schedule pays big dividends for Auburn, to be able to play at home, to be able to ease into it a little bit, to get some valuable reps and to get some of those butterflies out. That might work out really well for this team come late October, November.
So let's kind of put a bow on our breakout players. Jason, you and I put up a list this morning at the site. Maybe not necessarily breakout guys, but guys we thought improved over the course of camp. Guys that we thought took a step forward, who were able to kind of raise their stock. J.C. Hart was on that list, obviously. He's a guy that we've talked about all preseason. Our other guys that we had, Malcolm Simmons, we'll kind of touch on these, I guess, kind of one-on-one. I just think every time you talk to his coaches or teammates, they had the exact same thing to say about him, which was, maybe what he lacked in experience, being a guy who came here this summer, he made up for an effort every single play. And like talking to Cam Coleman, even just last week, he's like, man, that guy goes 100%. I don't know how many times I heard somebody say Malcolm Simmons goes 100%. Like they said it a million times during camp. We saw that in a scrimmage setting. I think if he wasn't already expected to be a guy who's going to play a few plays a game, I think he definitely cemented that this preseason. And then someone I wanted to touch on as well, Jason, that you and I both agreed on, Brandon Frazier, like lots of first team reps. And I think he is almost more of that straight tight end role, because you hear people talk about Rivaldo. You hear Cam Coleman last week talked about Rivaldo. They're like, he just does a lot of stuff that a receiver does. Like Cam Coleman talking about him saying, I don't consider him a tight end. He's a big receiver. Now, obviously, he's going to play tight end, but Frazier is maybe filling a little bit more. I think he's absorbing those Tyler Fromm snaps. He's maybe taking some of what Luke Deal did last season. We just saw a lot of first-team reps for him in the preseason. And talking to him a couple weeks ago, Jason, he was like, I'm tired of this team not being good, and I'm honestly tired of not making that much of an impact. I think he's a guy that realizes in his last season maybe this is his best opportunity to compete. And so I think maybe he's a guy that's sort of lost in the shuffle. Don't know how many receptions he can get. We talked about how deep this pass catcher group is this season, but by all accounts, he's had one of his better semesters at Auburn in terms of practice so far.
Yeah, it feels like that Brandon Frazier is the hybrid tight end. Rivaldo Fairweather, it feels like, is more of the, hey, we're going to split you out. We're going to use you. Now, he'll still be in the box some. We're going to split you out and be a big mismatch-bodied wide receiver almost at times. Luke Deal is hand on the ground, extra offensive tackle role. That's who he is. It feels like Brandon Frazier's in the middle of the, hey, let's be a traditional tight end, but also a guy that can go catch the ball. And so I agree. I think we saw last year for the first time him actually have a role on a team. He made a couple of catches, had a big game down at LSU. We saw that opening up for him. I think he's a guy there's never been a question about talent, hands, size. I mean, he's massive. I do think he can have an impact for this team and kind of that, Rivaldo Fairweather's called a hybrid, but it's more wide receiver almost. I think Brandon Frazier's more the hybrid, true hybrid tight end for this team. And back to Malcolm Simmons, a guy that I've watched a bunch. And there was never a doubt in my mind from an athletic standpoint that he was a guy that was going to have an impact on this level. I just didn't know that I expected it this quick. And it may tone down a little bit as you get into a season. But he's a guy that I thought maybe by the middle of the year, you start to ease him in a little bit here or there. To his credit and to the credit of Cam Coleman and Bryce Cain, but also these older wide receivers, they have taken these young guys in and invested in them to get them ready. Because that's the only way this happens. You're not going to be ready unless the other guys help you. That shows me that they have spent a lot of time in those voluntary throwing sessions over the summer with Peyton Thorne and the quarterbacks and the running backs and wide receivers. Because you don't get this ready with him and Perry Thompson. You don't get this ready unless you've done a lot of work to get prepared. And so they have done that. That's probably been the biggest thing for me is Malcolm's ability to go out there and to be more advanced as a wide receiver than I expected to be, just in terms of the route running. Still a lot of that to be done, and still a lot of things that need to be done moving forward. But this is a guy that only really played wide receiver 1 full year of high school. He was running back as a junior. He punted, played some safety, did all these things. As he focuses in, he's going to grow by leaps and bounds. I thought kind of Courtney Taylor for him a little bit. Courtney came in a redshirted. You had the other guys who were a little bit further ahead. I don't think we're going to see a red shirt from Malcolm Simmons.
Yeah, I think he's going to be, if I had to make a bet for the first game, it might be Malcolm Simmons scores a touchdown. And the reason I say that is because he can also do things with the ball in his hands. We heard Rees talk earlier in camp how he took a sweep in the red zone untouched. He is going to be a guy. Now, he is going to play against SEC teams. I don't know how much he's going to play, but I think we agree he will play a little bit. I think Malcolm could be the Alabama A&M killer this year. He could be the New Mexico go for 100 yards in the second half. Even if they don't throw the ball that much, I can see, because we already saw it against the second and third team DBs, and it's nothing against them. You just can't you don't have guys when those guys can't keep pace with him. So in the second half, worn down team, an FCS team, I can see a guy like Malcolm Simmons doing some damage. Perry Thompson, for that matter, if they put the ball in the air against these teams in the second half. But I might go ahead and go on record and say maybe late third quarter, early fourth quarter, Malcolm Simmons gets a sweep, takes it for a touchdown against a team like Alabama A&M. Other guys we had on here as having their stock risen in preseason camp. We already talked about K'Ron Crawford. I think we thought he'd be pretty good, but right away it was clear the kind of impact he was going to have. A couple guys on the D-line. Oh, Sam Jackson as well. We already talked about him at length, but I think the biggest difference for him was that shoulder injury in the spring. He was limited a lot. And then we pretty much saw him at the number 2 slot role this preseason all throughout. And then when Lambert Smith was hurt in that first scrimmage, when they had to shuffle things around, who was the first guy on the field? It was Sam Jackson. That tells you he might be their number 4 or 5 receiver, like overall, when you look at the group as a whole. So I think really good preseason for him. A couple guys on the D-line, Jason, that you and I touched on. Isaiah Rakes coming over from Texas A&M. And then a guy we've talked about a couple times already, Malik Blockton. With Malik, and I talked to him about this on Friday when we had an interview, I tell him, you've already got 30 plus practices under your belt. Like, does it feel like you're a true freshman anymore? And he was basically saying, from a perspective of like not starting school yet, he's like, yeah, I still feel pretty young. I feel like these older guys give me advice, but he was like, I've been out there at practice with this team for so long. I mean, he is a guy, what is it, 5 or 6 bowl practices is what they do? Something like that. I mean, he's had 35 plus practices in an Auburn uniform. And so from that perspective, I don't think it's a huge surprise that he's been able to break in. I see so much of Marcus in him in just being a guy that goes to work and has a really good head about him and is able to sort of absorb what they want him to do. Super versatile. I think we're going to see him in all kinds of different spots this preseason. And I'll say, Jason, like, I mean, you knew him better. Obviously, you and Christian watched him. I just didn't. He was not a guy from an outside looking at this recruiting class where I was like, you're what impact Malik Blockton, just because I just hadn't seen him on the field. But now kind of seeing the impact that he could have, it's not surprising. Number one, that the staff was so high on him, and number two, that it looks like he's gonna be able to play right away this season.
I think a ton of credit has to go to Malik because he didn't say, "Oh, I'm a guy." Now he was a high level 3-star guy, so he kind of has a chip on his shoulder anyway a little bit, but he never really talked about that. He just always went out and played, and he loves the game. It wasn't a big deal for him, but here's what he did. He went from a guy that was 275, 280 as a senior in high school, and that's probably what was the difference for him, because guys are going like, what's he gonna move like when he's 295? To his credit, he has put in the work to do that as a gradual step. So bowl practice, he gets out there and he goes, whew, okay, it's a little bit different world. I got to get bigger, and I got to get stronger, and I got to get more explosive. He already knew that from watching his older brother. Marcus Harris was a guy that people was like, how could that guy not be an SEC guy? He weighed 235, 240 coming out of high school, and he went to Kansas and he got bigger, and he came to Auburn and got bigger, but he kept his explosiveness and his power. That's what allowed him to be that guy. Malik has done the same things, but he's done it at a much quicker level. He was bigger already, but he has added that explosion and added, he's 293, 295, somewhere around in there now, but he's kept it. And he's probably quicker than he was last year. That's the starting point for him. The thing he always had was the technique, the fundamental stuff, and the desire and work ethic. And you can't talk about Malik, Marcus, and a lot of these guys without giving some credit to the Madhouse guys in Montgomery, because they instill some work ethic in guys and make them understand how tough it's going to be. And boy, Malik's been going since he was a freshman. I've been watching him since he was a freshman, and the job that they've done in kind of helping him be prepared along with his high school coaches and that extra work. They go Saturdays at 5:00 in the morning working out. That's the work ethic that it takes to succeed in college. And so when Malik got here, it wasn't a shock. And so I think that's been a big part of things for him. And he is going to play a role for this team as a true freshman and a team that has a bunch of defensive line guys. He's not playing because, they don't have anybody else. He's playing because he's been that good.
Yeah, and then Rakes. Obviously, this is such a deep room. Another group that we're excited to see how the rotation pans out. Just from like a nerdy snap count perspective, I'm just interested to kind of dive into those after the first couple games. But Rakes, um, even though he missed the spring, nobody knew Durkin's playbook better than him because he'd been doing it the last 2 seasons at Texas A&M. And when I asked him, he said it's the exact same, no differences, literally the exact same playbook. So that allowed him to sort of bypass the the lack of a spring practice and come in and, by all accounts, again, it is a rotation, but by all accounts, risen up to that number 1 nose tackle spot. He's just a guy that we heard was just doing a lot of the right things all throughout camp. And Free said it a couple weeks ago. He said, going through that D line, touching on a lot of different guys, he said Rakes has the potential to be that guy, like has shown himself. They're looking for a game breaker. They're looking for a guy who can, demand a lot of gravity there in the middle. Okay, the 6'1", 325-pound nose tackle who already knows the system in and out, that's a guy who can maybe take on that role for you. Talked a bunch about JC Hart. Don't need to touch on him again. Braden Joyner, I mean, again, another guy that I was not super familiar with during his recruiting process, Jason. And so I guess just, your perspective of what his progression has looked like the past couple of years, because he was a guy Jake Thornton went on and on about this preseason, and we've seen him slide into that 2 deep at guard. And who knows, if they've got question marks at guard right now and want to try moving some guys around, there is no reason he cannot be in that mix.
No, he's absolutely. I think he's probably the 3rd or 4th guy, and I don't think they would hesitate on putting Braden Jordan in the game at guard. We mentioned work ethic for Malik Blockton. It's been the same thing for Braden Joyner, but the other direction. The first thing he did was tear his body down. I think he got in last year and saw, okay, I'm big enough, but I can't move well enough at this level. I'm not as powerful as I need to be. I'm not as athletic as I need to be. So he started diet change, all these things, and he tore his body down. And now you look at him now and he looks like a different person. He's always been able to move. He's always been a good football player. I feel like the same thing with DeAndre Carter. I think it's the same thing. You look at it and you go, DeAndre Carter, you look and go, and Hugh Freeze mentioned it the other day, he's got some things he needs to do from a body standpoint to get prepared and then be there. But the footwork, all those things are there. It's the same thing with Braden Joyner. He put in the work to change his body, to get ready to be prepared to play at this level. And now it's showing up on the field. So work ethic, desire, wanting to be good, those are always the best characteristics that a young kid can have as you come into college football. And those are 2 guys that have done it. I mean, I think they've got a bunch of guys on this roster that you say, hey, they'd fit that mold. And that's a good spot to be in because as we can take this all the way back to recruiting. As you recruit at a high level, the more of those guys you bring in, the better your roster is going to be because they're going to come in ready to compete. And we've already seen it with this class. Make no mistake about it. People think about all the young guys. We know who it helps. It helps the older guys because you either shape up or ship out because those guys are coming for your job. The only way to keep it is to get better. That's how you create an atmosphere and a culture, as Hugh Freeze has talked about. That's how you create a culture, by bringing in guys that want your job and go compete and say, oh, look, I'm coming for you. And it's there every single day. We're seeing more of that on this Auburn roster already than we've seen in the last few years. How much will it pay off this year? I think it will, but I think it's going to pay off a lot more in the years to come when you keep adding those guys year after year.
Yeah, I agree. Speaking of recruiting at a high level, the last 2 guys on our list here of biggest improvements in preseason camp, Amaris Williams, he is the Cam Coleman of that defense in terms of absurd talent level. That's not surprising when you consider he's a 5-star. And then DeMarcus Riddick, who was, I believe, a composite 5-star at some point in his recruiting process. A super talented guy, I think a top 70-ish recruit, maybe higher than that. Actually, I think he's like number 38 recruit. Anyway, he was a guy you would talk about Malik Blockton being here since bowl practices. DeMarcus Riddick was also on campus for those, getting ready and went with the team to the Music City Bowl. So he's got a lot under his belt. He is in a situation where I think those 3 linebackers that they have, the veterans in Mahosi, Keys, and Asante, they're going to play, and there's really not much you can do about that. I do think DeMarcus Riddick is going to get into the mix this year, but for him, I think it was just, hey, you want him to develop properly because you think he is such a talented guy. And then Morris Williams, I mean, talk about versatility on this D-line and how many guys they're going to play. He could absolutely be somebody with a role. It just depends on how things play out, on how they use those different personnel groupings. But big, physical, and fast at that defensive end spot. When they shift things up, he could stay in the game as kind of that second pass rusher. You could almost get him standing up doing that. Just an absurd amount of talent. I mean, he's a guy that you watch on the practice field, and it was really, really convincing what he was able to do. And those are 2 guys also that Rees shouted out last Friday saying they don't get enough credit. Like, I don't think they're getting enough attention because he doesn't know what we write about. He doesn't know who we talk about.
Mm-hmm.
He says, I don't know how much attention they're getting, but Amaris Williams and DeMarcus Riddick need to be among that group. And so a couple really talented guys, like you said, maybe a couple years down the line, we're going to see them. They want to develop them into all SEC type players. And by all accounts, their first offseason at Auburn went pretty well going into their freshman year.
Yeah. This 2 guys that me and Christian had a chance to see for 5 or 6 days in San Antonio. It was really valuable. We had seen DeMarcus Riddick a bunch. We went and watched him play. But to see him in that setting with other really good players showed you immediately this guy's this is who we thought he was. It's who we thought he was. Now he's gotten bigger. Now he's added some of that size to be able to go out and compete. And another guy that had, a couple of sniffs of a bowl practice, but then was in through the spring. And then you look at Amaris Williams, and San Antonio showed us, holy cow, this guy is the freak that everybody said he was, because we had seen it on film. He played running back. He played all these different spots. And then you see him in San Antonio and you go, holy, this guy's running around guys that are offensive tackles that are, major college guys. He's not playing against, guys in his hometown. He's doing this against the best players in the country. And then he gets to Auburn and he's gotten bigger. But he hasn't gotten – I honestly thought he might get to 275 or so, and I think it's been really interesting to see that they kept him at that. He's almost the hybrid guy in terms of being a hybrid, jack linebacker, hybrid, true defensive end, where you're right. When you get to third down rolls, you could play him at defensive end if you wanted to, move Keldrick inside and still give you a bigger body guy on the edge, but a guy that can really run and do some things. So, 2 guys that I think, especially DeMarcus's case, I think we'll see a ton on special teams. I think DeMarcus Riddick and a lot of those young DBs, those guys will be guys on the coverage teams, J.C. Hart. I think we'll see a lot of them on special teams. And when you can get that kind of talent level on those groups, then you're in a pretty good spot.
Jason, this week we will get to talk with the coordinators, all 3 of them. Obviously, that includes Tanner Burns, special teams coordinator. We'll get to talk to some players as well. Tiger Talk is back tonight, moving to Mondays this year. So y'all be looking out for more of a review recap sort of thing, as opposed to when it was on Thursdays. Obviously, you're looking ahead to the next game. They'll have a little bit about the next game, but obviously being on Monday, it'll be more of a recap. I just saw that BP will be on tonight as well. And so it'll be a good show there. So that's what to expect the rest of the week. We had a comment about Rees when we get to talk to him. Won't be until game week, as at least that's how it currently looks. And he'll have his Monday press conferences as usual. And so, an interesting week, like we talked about, interesting in between week where the team will be working on honestly simulating what a game week is going to feel like. But that kind of wraps things up, guys. It's been a fun fall camp. It's always interesting to kind of see how things progress over the course of a camp. And look, this is a team, Jason, that Rees said on the first day of camp. He said, I expect these guys to be sharp. Like the year one sloppiness. What are we doing with this? What are we doing with that? He felt like that's kind of out of the way. Like they know what they want to do. He expected this team to execute at a high level. And so far, he said, he's been really pleased with what he's seen in that regard. We're getting close now to none of that matters anymore. It's you get on the field and make it happen. And so, I am really interested to continue to hear from these guys over the next few days as it's crunch time. It's crunch time now. Now it's finally time to get ready to play a football game after we've been up there on campus at practice for the better part of a month.
Yeah, and thanks goes to Heath Rees, Shelly Poe,
Sure.
everybody involved, because we maybe haven't talked to Freeze as much as we have head coaches in the past, but we have had an almost endless supply of information on a daily basis, whether it be assistant coaches. We've probably talked to, I'd like to see the count to go back to it. We've probably talked to 50 players in the preseason. Yep. I would get somewhere around in there, which is incredible at this point. So we've got to see practice and get a feel for the team, which has been great. Yeah, scrimmage situation, lockdown, but that's not really any different than most every coach we've had for the better part of the last decade. We just had a lot more early on. And so I just want to thank them for that. It has, I know this, and Nathan, you too. I feel like I know more about this team than I have the last 3 or 4 Auburn teams that we've covered, just from a standpoint of we've been able to see them and talk to them and get a feel. There's still a lot of question marks, but I do feel like I know more about this team because of the information that we've gathered already in preseason. Now looking forward to kind of getting to game week, as they start to prepare for opponent, and then get to Jordan-Hare Stadium.
Yeah, I mean, it was a good bit like that last year as well. Yeah, Freeze has been good on that front. I felt like we went into the first game, the things they struggled with, we were like, yeah, I mean, we've seen that at practice, or the things they excelled at, we were used to that as well. I do think it feels a lot to me like it did last year when we kind of exited the preseason and we were like, I think this defense might be a little better than people expect, and we were right last year. I think that's kind of an overarching takeaway, but I think that kind of gets lost in the shuffle here. They lost a lot of guys on defense. I think that's actually going to be a pretty good unit for them. I think they'll take their lumps maybe in different ways than they did last season. But like from a pass rush perspective, I'm just so interested to see what that D-line, like the fact that you're going to rotate guys so often. I'm just getting really interested to see what those lineups look like. But be here before you know it. Thank y'all for joining us today. We had tons of comments here on YouTube and Facebook, so we appreciate everybody tuning in. If you guys enjoyed the show, go leave us a 5-star review on the podcasting app of your choice, and we will talk to y'all later this week. Everybody have a good start to the week.